33 kilometers. That is the width of the world's most consequential strip of water at its narrowest point, a bent elbow of ocean between Iran and Oman that you could locate on any map in about 3 seconds. You'd almost overlook it. It looks like nothing, a thin blue gap between two coastlines, a geographic afterthought. And yet since March 4th, 2026, the closure of that gap has been described by the head of the International Energy Agency as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Not in recent history, not since the Cold War, in history. Full stop. What happened in that waterway, and what continues to happen, is not a news story anymore. It has crossed into something else entirely. It is a stress test on the architecture of modern civilization, and almost nobody is discussing the full depth of what it actually means. So let's do that now. To understand how a single narrow channel could bring the global economy to its knees, you first have to understand something that most people have never been taught: the way the modern world moves its energy. Not where energy comes from, how it travels. Because those are two very different things, and the difference between them is where all the power lives. The Persian Gulf is, by any reasonable measure, the most energy-dense region on Earth. It holds roughly half of the world's proven conventional oil reserves. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, these are not just producers. They are the geographic center of gravity for global industrial civilization. And every single barrel of oil, every cubic meter of liquefied natural gas, nearly every shipment of industrial fertilizer that leaves this region, virtually all of it exits through one opening, through that same 33 kilometers. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is the aorta of the global economy. Before this crisis, roughly 20 million barrels of oil passed through the strait every single day. That is approximately 1/5 of all oil consumed on Earth. Around a quarter of all seaborne oil trade worldwide. On top of that, enormous volumes of liquefied natural gas, largely from Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, flowed through it daily. And then there's something most commentators ignore almost entirely: fertilizer. About a third of all seaborne fertilizer trade in the world normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Urea, ammonia, the nitrogen compounds that grow the food that feeds billions of people. This is not just an oil story. It never was. The events that brought us here began accelerating long before the first missile was fired. For years, tensions between Iran, the United States, and Israel had been building around Iran's nuclear program, a program that Tehran insisted was civilian, that Washington and Tel Aviv treated as existential. By early 2026, nuclear negotiations in Geneva had collapsed. The diplomatic runway had run out. And on February 28, 2026, under an operation called Epic Fury, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran, targeting military installations, nuclear sites, and senior leadership. In the strikes, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. What followed was not surprising to anyone who had studied Iran's strategic doctrine. Iran hit back. Missile barrages struck Israeli cities and American military bases across the Gulf, in the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain. Then, 2 days later, on March 2nd, a senior official of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps made it official. The Strait of Hormuz was closed. Any ship attempting to transit would be attacked. And they meant it. The American flag vessel Stena Imperative was struck twice at the port of Bahrain. A port worker was killed. Tanker traffic, which normally runs at between 6,000 and 8,000 ships over a 2-month period, dropped towards zero. War risk insurance premiums for vessels attempting the strait exploded from less than 1% of a ship's value per transit to as high as 10%. The economics became impossible almost overnight. Ship owners didn't need to be told twice. The ships stopped moving, and with them stopped the oil, the gas, the fertilizer. The market reaction was immediate and ferocious. Brent crude, which had been trading at around $72 a barrel before the strikes, surged 10 to 13% within days. By March 8th, it had crossed $100 a barrel for the first time in 4 years. At its peak, it reached $126. Wall Street analysts began privately running scenarios for what happens if it hits 200. That number, $200 per barrel, had always been treated as a theoretical extreme, a doomsday figure people invoke in hypotheticals but don't actually expect to see. By late March 2026, U.S. government officials were beginning to take it seriously as a possibility. Think carefully about what $200 oil means in practice. It doesn't just mean gasoline gets expensive, it means everything gets expensive. Because petroleum is not only a fuel, it is a feedstock. It's embedded in the plastic of every product you touch, in the synthetic fibers of the clothes you wear, in the asphalt of every road, in the production process of virtually everything manufactured at scale. A $200 oil world is a world where the cost of producing, packaging, and shipping nearly every consumer good jumps simultaneously. And the inflation that follows doesn't look like a number on a chart, it feels like hunger. And hunger is exactly what started happening. The Gulf Cooperation Council states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, are among the most food import-dependent societies on Earth. Kuwait and Qatar import over 90% of their calories. By mid-March 2026, 70% of the region's food imports had been disrupted. Retailers were airlifting basic staples. Consumer food prices in the Gulf spiked by 40 to 120% in a matter of weeks. Iranian strikes on desalination plants, the source of nearly all drinking water in Kuwait and Qatar, began shifting what was already a humanitarian emergency towards something potentially far worse. But here's what makes the food story so dangerously underreported. The crisis wasn't just about Gulf populations losing access to food imports. It was about the entire world losing access to the agricultural inputs needed to grow food. The FAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, issued an extraordinary warning in May 2026. Its Director General said bluntly that the global fertilizer scarcity caused by the Strait of Hormuz disruption would lead to lower crop yields and tightening food supplies, not just for the rest of 2026, but extending well into 2027. Because agriculture operates on a crop calendar that cannot be postponed. Fertilizer must be applied at specific moments in the growing cycle. If it doesn't arrive on time, the yield is already lost, regardless of what happens in the strait 6 months later. Think about what that means. Even if the strait reopened tomorrow, the damage to next year's harvest in large parts of Africa, South Asia, and South America is already done. The food crisis from the Hormuz closure isn't coming. In many places, it has already been embedded into the ground, into the fields that weren't fertilized in time. Countries like India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Somalia, Sudan, Tanzania, Kenya, Egypt, these are nations that the FAO specifically flagged as being among those most at risk. Nations with limited fiscal space, high debt burdens, populations already stretched thin by the inflation and supply chain disruptions of the previous several years. For them, the Strait of Hormuz isn't a geopolitical abstraction. It's the difference between food being affordable and food becoming a crisis. The United Nations World Food Program issued an estimate that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. If the strait did not reopen soon, the number of people experiencing hunger, mostly in Asia and Africa, would rise by a figure too large to treat as a rounding error. But pull back further, because even this is not the complete picture. One of the least discussed dimensions of the Hormuz crisis is what it has done to supply chains that appear, on the surface, to have nothing to do with the Middle East. Take copper mining in Chile. Copper processing requires sulfuric acid. A significant portion of the world's sulfuric acid exports came from the Persian Gulf. When the strait closed, China, itself dependent on Gulf sulfuric acid, responded by halting its own exports to secure domestic supply. The consequence landed in the Atacama Desert, thousands of miles from any Iranian missile. Chilean copper mines began facing acid shortages. Copper production slowed. And copper is in everything from electrical wiring to electric vehicles to the infrastructure of the energy transition. Aviation was disrupted not just by fuel price spikes, but by airspace closures. Key flight corridors linking Europe, Asia, and Africa were thrown into chaos. Airlines rerouted around the Middle East, burning more fuel, charging higher fares, watching operating costs spiral. Several major Middle Eastern airports, hubs that collectively handle around 15% of global air traffic, were shuttered. Jet fuel costs, already under pressure from the oil shock, nearly doubled. Shipping costs metastasized. Amazon, FedEx, and the United States Postal Service implemented emergency fuel surcharges. The cost of moving anything, anywhere on the planet ticked upward. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, not an institution given to hyperbole, ran a formal economic model. The conclusion? A full closure of the strait during the second quarter of 2026, removing close to 20% of global oil supplies from the market, was expected to raise oil prices to $98 per barrel on average and cut global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points for that quarter alone. That is not a slowdown. At that magnitude, the word recession begins to appear on the models. Bloomberg Economics, running a parallel analysis using its shock model, found that at oil around $110 per barrel, the impact on inflation and growth was marked but, in their words, manageable. But if the strait remained closed deeper into the second quarter and oil moved toward $170, the impact roughly doubled. That scenario, stagflationary, persistent, with implications for central bank policy, currency markets, and political stability across multiple continents, began to feel less like a tail risk and more like a trajectory. The Kiel Institute for the World Economy, studying welfare impacts across countries not directly involved in the conflict, found that energy-dependent developing economies in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East were by far the most exposed. Food price increases in the most vulnerable nations were estimated at between 2 and 5%, even in near-term scenarios. For countries where families already spend 60 or 70% of their income on food, a 5% increase in food prices is not an economic statistic. It is a destabilizing social event. Now consider the strategic geometry. Iran, a country that has lived under American sanctions for most of 4 decades, has for years been developing a doctrine that its military strategists call asymmetric leverage. The concept is straightforward. You cannot match the United States in conventional military power, so you build unconventional instruments of coercion that are cheap to activate and enormously expensive for your adversary to neutralize. Mines in the Persian Gulf, drone swarms, missile arsenals pointed at Gulf state infrastructure, and above all, the Strait of Hormuz as a geographic veto on the global economy. The mathematics of this leverage are brutal. Iran does not need to destroy the strait to weaponize it. It doesn't even need to physically block every ship. It only needs to make the insurance, the risk calculation, and the operational environment hostile enough that commercial operators stop sending vessels through. That threshold, the point at which commercial shipping stops, not because of direct attacks on every hull, but because the economics become prohibitive, was crossed almost immediately. The strait became commercially unusable before it was fully militarily closed. As the Stimson Center's analysis observed, a soft closure inflicts nearly the same damage as a declared blockade. And this is where the conversation about power shifts in ways that deserve serious attention. The countries that Iran designated as friends and explicitly permitted to transit the strait after its March 27th announcement were China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan. This was not a random list. It was a geopolitical statement. It was Iran drawing a map of a world without the West at the center. And while the diplomatic signaling was as much theater as strategy, the underlying reality it pointed toward was real. China receives roughly a third of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. In 2024, around 84% of the crude oil passing through the strait was destined for Asian markets. Japan and South Korea depend on Gulf oil structurally. Pakistan and Bangladesh are extraordinarily price-sensitive to energy costs. Asia, in aggregate, is the region whose entire industrial model is most exposed to a Hormuz disruption. And yet Iran explicitly carved out a pathway for some of the most significant Asian powers. The United States, by contrast, finds itself in an increasingly complex position. American domestic oil production, the shale revolution, has given Washington a degree of energy insulation that it simply didn't have in 1973 or 1979. American gas prices surged by over $1.16 a gallon in the weeks after the war began, reaching an average of $4.56 by early May. But the United States is not facing the existential fuel starvation that Japan or South Korea face. What it is facing is the political and economic cost of a war whose consequences are ricocheting through global supply chains in ways that are difficult to control and nearly impossible to reverse quickly. Trump's public communications during the crisis, alternating between threats to obliterate Iranian power plants, promises of imminent ceasefires, and social media posts suggesting the war was nearly over, had the effect of making oil traders deeply uncertain about where prices should settle. Markets hate uncertainty more than they hate bad news, and the uncertainty bred volatility, which bred speculation, which amplified the price signals already coming from the underlying supply disruption. Meanwhile, the Gulf states themselves, the oil monarchies that were supposed to be America's strategic partners in the region, found themselves in a position nobody had designed for. Iraq and Kuwait began curtailing oil production by early March, not by choice but by necessity. As the strait closed, local storage filled, and with nowhere to export, wells had to be shut in. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the two Gulf states with limited pipeline alternatives to the strait, rushed to push oil through those routes. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline and Abu Dhabi's export connections. But those alternatives, even at maximum capacity, could not come close to replacing what the strait normally carried. The gap between what could be rerouted and what the world needed remained enormous. Qatar Energy, one of the most consequential energy companies on the planet, declared force majeure on all of its export contracts. Force majeure is a legal term that means circumstances beyond our control have made it impossible to fulfill our obligations. In plain language, the gas we promised you isn't coming. Qatar's LNG liquefaction facilities, which transform natural gas into the liquid form that can be shipped, suffered missile damage. Qatar Energy warned that some of that damage could take up to 5 years to repair. 5 years. Europe, which had pivoted heavily toward Qatari LNG after Russia's invasion of Ukraine disrupted Russian pipeline gas, was now looking at yet another major disruption to its energy supply at almost the exact moment it had thought the worst was behind it. The phrase energy security gets used so frequently in policy discussions that it has nearly lost its meaning. The Hormuz crisis restored that meaning in the most visceral possible way. It showed that energy security is not about production capacity. It is about transit. It is about the thin, fragile threads of infrastructure and geography through which civilization's fuel supply actually flows. And it showed that those threads run through places that are not stable, not certain, and not under anyone's complete control. There is something important to understand about the historical precedents here, and about why this moment is genuinely different from what came before. The 1973 oil embargo was a political weapon wielded by Arab states against specific Western nations. The 1979 Iranian Revolution disrupted Iranian oil exports. The Iran-Iraq War damaged infrastructure across both countries. The 1990 Gulf War removed Iraqi and Kuwaiti production from the market. These were severe shocks. But in each case, the disruption was partial. The rest of the market had significant spare capacity to deploy, and the disruption was confined primarily to oil. The 2026 Hormuz crisis is different in 3 ways that compound each other. First, the disruption is total, not partial. Ships stopped moving through the strait almost entirely. The tanker traffic that would normally see between 6,000 and 8,000 transits over the affected period dropped to a handful, effectively zero. Second, it is not just oil. It is oil and gas and fertilizer simultaneously, with cascading effects into food security, chemical supply chains, aviation, and emerging market debt. The breadth of affected sectors is unprecedented. Third, the global economy in 2026 is not the global economy of 1973. It is more interconnected, more complex, more tightly coupled across supply chains that have been optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. Just-in-time logistics and lean inventory management, the great victories of modern supply chain thinking, become catastrophic liabilities the moment a major input stops flowing. There are no buffers. The IEA coordinated a record release of strategic petroleum reserves, an effort reportedly capable of reaching 3 million barrels per day. Governments across Asia and Europe activated demand reduction measures. The Philippines began a temporary 4-day work week to conserve fuel. Countries scrambled to source oil from producers outside the Gulf, from the United States, from Canada, from West Africa, from Latin America. Canadian oil producers, suddenly in extraordinary demand, began recording historic profits even as their government scrambled to address the inflation shock hitting Canadian consumers. But here is what the emergency measures could not fix, and what the strategic reserve releases could not replace: the forward visibility into what the world's food system will look like in 6 to 12 months. The fertilizer that didn't move in March and April. The crops that won't be planted correctly. The yields that are already going to come in lower than projected. The FAO's warning was precise and devastating in its simplicity. Agriculture operates on a crop calendar that cannot be postponed. You cannot retroactively fertilize a field. The food consequences of the Hormuz closure will not fully arrive until the harvests of late 2026 and 2027. And when they arrive, the political consequences in countries that are already fragile will arrive with them. There is a geopolitical pattern worth understanding here, one that operates beneath the headlines in the structural logic of the crisis rather than in its daily drama. For decades, the United States maintained its strategic position in the Middle East partly through its role as the guarantor of free navigation through the Persian Gulf. The U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, the military presence across the region, these were not just assets for projecting power, they were the physical insurance policy that kept the world's energy supply chain moving. The implicit bargain was simple. American military presence meant open seas, which meant energy flows, which meant global growth. That bargain has now been stress-tested in the most dramatic way possible. And the test revealed that even the most powerful military in human history cannot instantly reopen a strait whose closure has been made commercially prohibitive through a combination of naval threat, drone warfare, insurance withdrawal, and the terrifying unpredictability of Iranian tactical responses. The world is watching something older than the headlines. It is watching the limits of force projection in an age of asymmetric warfare. It is watching what happens when a determined, prepared adversary decides that the pain of disruption is worth the strategic objective. And it is watching the global economy, the most complex system ever built by human civilization, reveal how fragile its dependencies really are when the wrong 33 kilometers of water become contested. What comes after this crisis ends, whenever that happens, will not simply be a return to the previous state of affairs. The insurance markets will carry the memory of it for years, repricing risk in the Gulf permanently upward. Shipping companies will redesign their routing strategies. Governments that were exposed will accelerate energy diversification programs they had previously treated as optional. The Gulf states whose desalination plants were struck, whose oil fields were shut in, whose economic models assumed stable exports forever, they will be renegotiating everything. And China, watching all of this from across a trade war with Washington that has already reshaped global commerce, is drawing its own conclusions about what it means to run an economy whose industrial heart depends on oil flowing through a waterway controlled by a strategic adversary's willingness to keep it open. The world that comes out the other side of this will be more fractured, more regionally self-sufficient by necessity, more distrustful of single-point dependencies. It will carry higher baseline energy costs, higher food prices, higher insurance premiums, and a recalibrated understanding of what geopolitical risk actually means in practice. And somewhere in the Gulf of Oman, ships still wait at anchor. Mariners from a dozen countries, over 20,000 of them by late April, aboard more than 2,000 vessels, stranded in the Persian Gulf because the waterway home has become a battlefield. They are the human face of the civilizational calculus that got us here. Workers from India, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Indonesia, people who signed on to carry the world's energy from one place to another, now caught in the geometry of powers they had no part in choosing. The economists will eventually calculate the precise GDP loss. The historians will frame the geopolitical turning point. The strategists will write their postmortems about what failed and what held and what the lesson is for next time. But perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about 33 kilometers of water in the Persian Gulf is this. We built a civilization on the assumption that certain things would always flow. Oil, gas, grain, money, information. And we built that civilization without ever seriously asking what happens when one of those flows stops. We are no longer in the world where that question is hypothetical.